Let's turn now to exploring the Shema discussions on the issues of Trinity and take a little bit of time and work our way down through some of the material here. You can find my Exploring the Shema discussions on the issues of Trinity study on my website at tetzetorah.com. Right from the home page, that cluster of links that you see there, it's right there where it says discussions on the issues of Trinity. So I invite you to click on the study there. We're working our way down through this chart, as I mentioned, that CARM put together. Let me scroll to the part that we need. Here we go. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, as you can see on my screen. And last week we looked at how Father, Son, Holy Spirit resurrected Yeshua. Tonight we're going to look at how the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit indwell. They indwell. And so let's just turn right to it. We've got three passages this time. First passage is 2 Corinthians 6:16. We're going to read how Paul talks about how that it is God who is dwelling within us or in the midst of us or among us. We're going to play with those words in the midst of, among, within, as we look at that passage. Then we're going to turn to Colossians 1:27, how Paul describes how that it is Messiah within us, the hope of glory, right? Christ in you, the hope of glory. And we're going to see how it's important that Paul understood that God in us is Christ in us. And then lastly, we'll turn to the book of John and see how Yeshua explained to his disciples how that is the Holy Spirit is going to dwell within us. And so it's these triadic passages taken together as a whole that give us the bigger picture that we're dealing with one being known as God, but yet three persons as expressed in Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And so let's just look at this. 2 Corinthians, 6:16. Let's turn to that verse first. 6:16. Sorry about that. I'm looking at the wrong verse. Okay. Paul says, "What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God said, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." Now, we're familiar with the Old Testament picture of God's tabernacle, which later became the temple, in which the presence of God moved in, as it were, to the building. But is that really what God wanted us to understand when he says, build a tabernacle and later a temple, and I will dwell in it or dwell among you as the temple exists among you? Let's look at this for a moment. Paul tells us that we are the temple of the living God, which means at the very outset, Paul understands that in some mysterious way, God takes up residency within us as the very temple. Just like the picture in the Old Testament where the temple was the place that God's presence, his Shekhinah, his glory, his manifest presence, took up residency. In like fashion, in a midrashic way, in a homiletic way, but in a very real way, not just in mysterious, not just ethereal, not just in theory, but in reality, we are the very temple of the living God, which means he lives inside of us. And notice the quote, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God. God doesn't just dwell among us as believers, he actually dwells within us. So let's play with this idea of dwelling among us versus dwelling within us. What is this language from the Tanakh, from the Old Testament? Again, we could take notice that in the various versions, as I've got pulled up on my screen, some of the passages, let me jump back over to the Greek for a split second. The last phrase where it says, I will make my dwelling among them. This Greek word among them. Let's see, where do I want to find it? Here we go. Actually, the Greek says in them, right? Enoikeso in autois. This phrase right here, I will dwell in autois, them. Third person pronoun here. What's most important for me, what jumps off the page for me, is this Greek preposition en, which translates into English as I in. So notice that the ESV says, I will make my dwelling among them. But emphatically, we could say in the Greek, I will make my dwelling in them. So this is what I want to challenge us with just a little bit tonight. Let's look at this idea. Dwelling among them compared with dwelling in them. And what's at stake here is that if you ask your average Jew, does God dwell among us? Everybody's going to say, yeah. Most Jews, most religious Jews, yeah, of course God dwells among us. But if you ask him, does God dwell in you? That's where you're going to get a little bit of a challenge. Christians agree that God dwells in us, right? Via his Holy Spirit, via the Son of God himself. But your average Jew is challenged with this notion of God dwelling in us. Can that happen? How does that work? Okay, so this is why it's important for us to look at sometimes little words like in versus among. If you look at your average English versions for this particular verse, you're going to find a variety. NIV says, we are the temple of the living God. God says, I will live with them. New Living Translation says, I will live in them. So notice right away, even from a Christian perspective, we realize that this Greek word en, but we translate it into English as in. This Greek word has kind of a range of meanings. Does it mean in us or does it mean among us? As we've already looked at, ESV says among them. Berean Study Bible says with them. The Berean Literal Bible says, God says, I will dwell in them. KJV says, I will dwell in them. New KJV, same thing, in them. NASB says, I will dwell among them. So you guys get the idea. Is it really in or is it among? Well, it's yes. The answer is yes. It's both in and among, depending on which translation you read and depending on what you're trying to emphasize. So I'll just kind of give you the bottom line up front.